Actress, As an actress, her stage credits include world premieres at Yale Repertory Theater, the Goodman Theater, the American Conservatory Theater, and others. She starred in The Journey, the first American independent film shot in Armenia. As a writer, her first feature film script, The First Full Moon, was a 2011 Sundance RAWI Screenwriters Lab participant and 2012 Dubai Film Connection Festival project. Ms. Tatoyan has co-founded Disruptive Narrative, a new social justice, social enterprise production company with international human rights barrister Jennifer Robinson of Doughty Street Chambers. In addition, Ms. Robinson and Ms. Tatoyan have co-founded Hakawati, a nonprofit storytelling project focusing on elevating the voices of frontline communities. Ms. Tatoyan served on the World Cinema Jury of the Juhok IFF in Iraqi Kurdistan, and as Rudolf Arnheim Guest Artist Professor at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Her speaking engagements include Storytelling as Spiritual Vehicle, a response to the Armenian genocide and Syrian refugee crisis at the Brandenburger Gate Foundation in Berlin, and Trauma Magic Love, Being in Aleppo with Karagöz's Puppets, My Ancestors and the Spirit of Osman Kavala at CMES Harvard University. Ms. Tatoyan is a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo and received her yoga teaching certification in Goa, India. Thank you. I will pass it on to you, Sona.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sadin. So we'll begin. There was, and there was not. There was a king who one day caught his wife cheating on him. And in his rage, he killed the lover and he killed his wife. Heartbroken, traumatized, he felt that all women were evil and untrustworthy, and so in recourse, he decreed that he would marry a new woman every day and the following morning kill her, ensuring that what had happened to him would never again happen. Now, the king had a vizier, his right-hand man, and it was his responsibility to find a new woman for him to marry every day and kill the following morning. This bloody rampage went on for a while until one day the vizier's eldest daughter, Scherazad, told her father that she'd like to volunteer to be the next in line to marry the king. Well, naturally, the vizier thought his daughter was crazy. It means you'll be dead the next morning, he said. But Scheherazade, she insisted. She was headstrong, she was bold, and finally, devastated, her father succumbed to his daughter's wishes. But meanwhile, Scheherazade had a plan, and she enlisted her younger sister Dunyazad to help her. She asked Dunyazad to come to the castle after the king had had his way with Scheherazade and to allow Scheherazade to tell her one final story, knowing that the following day her sister would be killed. Dunyazad naturally agreed. So she arrives and she asks to hear a story, which Scheherazade begins to tell. Now, Scheherazade was a brilliant, captivating, extraordinary storyteller. And she wove her tale and reached the climax of the story right at dawn when all speaking needed to cease in the kingdom. So the king was left hanging. He wanted to know what happened, but Scheherazade told him that unfortunately now she must be quiet. It's the rules of the kingdom. They need to sleep. His curiosity too great, the king decided that he would keep Scheherazade alive for one more day to hear the rest of the story, just knowing that he'll kill her the following morning. Well, the next day, Scheherazade continues her story. And upon its completion, she weaves another fantastical tale, forcing the king to keep her alive yet again. This continued for 1,001 nights, in which time Scheherazade bore the king 3 children, and he had fallen desperately in love with her. In this way, she saved herself, the rest of the women of the kingdom, and by extension, humanity itself. It's through her ingenuity, her courage and patience that Scheherazade disarmed a violent, traumatized man, and in her feminine way taught him through all this how to truly be a king, extending his patience and allowing his wisdom to evolve past his pain. Scheherazade faced her greatest fear, walking towards what could possibly have been her death. She believed firmly that she must try to disrupt this happening through a different means. If she was armed with story and art, she was fortified by bravery and patience. And she had with her tools much mightier than a sword, the way to engage the human mind and heart. This frame story of 1001 Nights, a cornerstone of storytelling and literature, which comes from the Middle East, the Near East, points us towards something very deep within ourselves, our capacity to heal as human beings, and the necessary tools for that very healing. You see, life by its nature is full of devastating events, heartbreaking circumstances. There is no life in the world that is impervious to pain. And pain breaks, it fragments parts of us from each other. Yet, we are also given the means with which to counter this breaking and fragmentation. How to piece ourselves back together in ways stronger for the breaking. Now, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is a pioneer in trauma research and the author of the seminal book on trauma and how we heal from it holistically, entitled The Body Keeps the Score. And he talks about trauma as not only a horrific event that is relegated to the past, childhood violence, abuse, the experience of war, genocide, sexual abuse, extreme betrayals of some kind, but also the imprint of these experiences on our brains, on our minds, and on our bodies that changes our internal maps and understanding of the world. After these events and this reshaping, how we experience the world literally changes. You see, we come into this world a blank slate. Our brains develop and come online bit by bit. The first part of us, our reptilian brain, our ancient animal brain, is located in our brainstem and is responsible for the things that newborn babies do: eat, sleep, cry, breathe, feel hunger, pain, urinate, defecate. Right above our reptilian brain is our limbic system, known as the mammalian brain, because all animals that live in groups and nurture their young have one. The development of this part of our brain takes off once we're born. This part of us is the seat of our emotions. It monitors danger. It judges what's pleasurable and scary. It's the arbiter of what is or is not important for survival. It's also the central command for coping with challenges of living within our complex social networks. This part of us is shaped in response to experience, together with our genetic makeup and our inborn temperament. Whatever happens to us as a baby shapes this part of us. So if we feel safe and loved, our brain specializes in managing feelings of exploration, play, cooperation. If we're scared and we feel unwanted, it specializes in managing feelings of fear and abandonment. Now, together, the reptilian brain and our limbic system make up our emotional brain, which is at the heart of our central nervous system, and its main task is to look out for our welfare. These parts of us come online when we are still preverbal, before we have language, linguistic organization of our experiences. And then there's the third part and the top layer of our brain, which is the neocortex. We share this with mammals, but it's much thicker in us humans. And this is the part of us that gives us language. It enables us to have abstract thought. It gives us the ability to absorb and integrate huge amounts of information and attach meaning to it It is the storytelling part of who we are as human beings. It is the part of us that allows us to plan, to reflect, to imagine, to play out future scenarios, to predict what will happen based on one thing and taking a certain action or neglecting another. It makes choice possible, and it underlies our incredible creativity. It is the part of us that has created culture. And it is the part of us that is the seat of our empathy and our ability to feel into someone else. Now that I gave you a little science lesson, when something traumatic happens, war, genocide, violent childhood experience, sexual abuse, intense feelings of fear and sadness and anger, all increase the oldest parts of our brain, alerting us to danger, and it decreases the activation of our frontal lobe, our ability to absorb and integrate information, to imagine and create. Also, when the limbic system, our emotional brain, decides something is threatening, the pathways of communication between our frontal lobe and our emotional brain become strained. This means rational and emotional parts are out of sync. And even if we may know intellectually and rationally that something isn't threatening us now, if it reminds us on the deep emotional level of something that did harm us, we will move now from that place. Because trauma isn't just the experience of an event when it happens, but it is the imprint of that experience in the reshaping of our brains. And as evolutionary creatures wanting to survive, our brains adapt in an effort to be vigilant in making sure that horrible thing never happens again. We are embodied creatures. We feel and experience life somatically through our physical organism. Our bodies are our truest homes. They hold our feelings. Overwhelming experiences affect these innermost sensations and our relationship to our physical reality and the core of who we are. Again, trauma is an event that took place sometime in the past. It is the imprint left by that experience on our minds, on our brains, on our bodies. And this ongoing consequence has consequences for how we survive now. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way our minds manage perceptions, and it alters not just how we think and what we think about, but our very capacity to think. So the king is traumatized when he witnesses his wife's infidelity. On a visceral level, he breaks. In order to protect himself from never again feeling that brokenness, he decides to take an astonishing, horrific, seems to us, course of action. If he marries a new woman every day and kills her immediately the following morning, no woman will ever again betray him and break his heart. Enter Scherazad, the feminine wisdom. On a deep instinctual level, Scherazad knows that she must step in to heal this madness. Heal, not stop. There's a difference. For trauma needs to be healed. It doesn't just go away, and attacking it head on, any sort of violent approach will only exacerbate the brokenness. Violence never eradicates violence. If anything, it's a temporary, ego-fueled solution that sees things from a binary perspective, a perspective of fragmentation. So as the world around Scherazad breaks more and more each day, a result of this unimpeded violence, a violence born of fear and trauma, Scherazad knows that she must counter it with a higher principle, love, creation. She knows that she must devote to the restoration of peace. She employs bravery, facing the possibility of her own annihilation, but she does so of her own volition. This gives her agency and a voice to confront the situation, and both of these are necessary aspects of avoiding and healing trauma after a horrific experience. You see, as human beings, we are interdependent creatures. We live and grow through connection with other human beings. We need each other. But trauma makes it difficult to engage in intimate relationships. After experiencing something so horrific, how do we learn to trust ourselves or anyone else again? How do we surrender to intimacy after being violated and broken? Trauma is deeply isolating. That fragmentation, it makes us feel as if we are alone. But communicating fully is the opposite of being traumatized. Being able to share our deepest pain and deepest feelings with another human being is one of the most profound experiences we can have. And it's fundamental to healing the isolation of trauma. More so if we've been ignored or silenced to begin with. Feeling listened to, understood, it changes our physiology, it lights up our limbic system, our emotional brain. We heal as human beings in the context of relationship. But silence often accompanies trauma, and silence reinforces the isolation of trauma. As long as we keep secrets, suppress information, we're fundamentally at war with ourselves. Hiding our core feelings takes tremendous energy. Energy away from connecting to other human beings in relationship, which is a source of our healing and what we actually yearn for. We thrive in this intimacy and community. Trauma disconnects us from bodies and from each other. But as human beings, we are also storytelling animals. We navigate the world through story. We understand who we are through narrative, the organizing principle of our reality in what otherwise could seem a chaotic cosmos. We orient ourselves this way. We make sense of what's happened and what could happen next based on our past experience. Storytelling reminds us of our common humanity, being listened to, witnessed, witnessing, and listening to. It helps us explore the experience of being human, and it gives us a visceral understanding of our connectedness. It de-isolates us and is the perfect antidote to trauma, which has fractured us. So let's go back to Scheherazade, the healer. Scheherazade knew instinctively what W.H. Auden, the poet, said when he meant what he said when he said, "Truth, like love and sleep, resents approaches that are too intense." The truth is, the king wasn't a maniac for no reason. His emotional brain had become traumatized and overstimulated to be on the lookout for further similar threat. And his prefrontal cortex, the seat of his imagination, reason, and creativity, was largely offline and shut down. So night after night, Scheherazade slowly ignites the king's imagination. His prefrontal cortex begins to be flooded and comes back online. And simultaneously, she soothes his emotional brain. He now has an experience of a woman who's not betraying him, who is consistent in her gentleness and ability to enrapture him. She uses this power of story, this uniquely human capacity, and plants into his consciousness night after night other possibilities of being human. She broadens his world and his understanding of the human condition. And day by day, night by night, he softens. The broken parts of him begin to be woven back together gently with each tale that Scheherazade weaves. And as he listens, the silenced parts of him come back online. His heart opens, and gradually he realizes he's fallen in love again. His world is a safe place. He trusts, and he's healed. The great psychoanalyst Carl Jung said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." One doesn't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. As human beings, often we're self-soothing and distancing ourselves from what hurts. Naturally, we don't want to feel it. Whether we drink, smoke, take drugs, have codependent relationships, keep constantly busy with work to avoid self-reflection, have some sort of religious or spiritual practice we cling to as salvation and spiritually bypass without deep self-investigation, anything that keeps us from looking at our pain, our shadows, and working to digest them, we're avoiding facing our own souls. And maybe it works for a while. We get by for a while. However, when we avoid facing our own souls, we cause ourselves harm. We repeat patterns of destruction, and eventually these patterns catch up to us. What we don't digest properly rots and causes further destruction. In late July of last year, I moved to Armenia. How could I have known that 2 months later, I'd wake up in an idyllic village in Lori Valley, I'd turn on my phone and learn that Stepanakert was being bombed. A war was being waged against Armenians on the indigenous Armenian land of Artsakh. All of a sudden, I watched 50 men out of a village of 800 people go to war. And a darkness and a silence descended on what had been an Edenic corner of northern Armenia. Days later, I went to Yerevan, and upon entering the city, I was confronted with billboards of military images and the phrase that had quickly been adopted as a call to solidarity, "Achdeluyenk," we will win in Armenian. This phrase was tagged on sidewalks, on sides of buildings, in front of businesses and restaurants. It astonished me how quickly this had happened, but something began to really trouble me. Even as I was moved by the massive coming together of collecting humanitarian aid on sidewalks throughout the city, I had to get off social media. I needed to go quiet and understand why I felt so troubled and unable to follow suit with the calls of "we will win." You know, I'm someone who's always been curious to understand the root of things. For years now, I've been on my own journey to heal my own trauma. This has led me to spending over a year in India, various practices of yoga and mindfulness meditation, to hours and hours of work with a trauma therapist practicing somatic experiencing, being on the tables of acupuncturists and reading the work of leading physicians and experts on trauma, Dr. Bezel Vanderkalk, who I mentioned, and Mark Wolin. You know, and I've become fascinated with learning about epigenetics, how trauma actually changes the expression of our genes and how these altered genes literally pass down through families. They are inherited on a biological level. It's been scientifically evidenced and acknowledged for survivors of the Holocaust and their descendants, and can be said for survivors of the Armenian genocide and generations of their progeny, or any other massive horror for that matter. And as an artist, I've been obsessed with the sublimation of trauma. How can we heal it? How can we not remain victims to it? Now, in my own journey, I've come to realize that it is by facing it slowly, gently, easily, very compassionately. In my work with Mark Wolin, who wrote the extraordinary book, It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle, he's helped me understand this concept of family consciousness, an inherited shared experience of the world. In order to heal, we have to go into these roots and to get into the soil of ourselves, into our dirt and our darkness, which is also the fecund place where things grow. I'll tell you a very personal story and a discovery that I made with Mark recently. So my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was a 5-month-old fetus in his mother's womb in 1915 in Ottoman Turkey, when his father's head was delivered by Turkish gendarmes to his mother. At this moment, the level of trauma my great-grandmother experienced upon receiving this, the shock, the horror, the fear, the brokenness, would have immediately been absorbed into the forming body and brain of my grandfather, the 5-month-old fetus, impacting him and shaping his reptilian brain and psyche, imprinting on him a deep connection he wouldn't cognitively be aware of. Pregnancy is dangerous and traumatizing and causes tragedy. Again, he's not aware of this. It's pre-verbal. Years later, as the father-in-law to my mother, when she's pregnant with me, her first child, he unconsciously, he unwittingly says things to my mother like, "Don't get so happy. We don't know what you're going to give birth to. Could be an animal." Traumatizing my young immigrant mother, already separated from her family in Aleppo and feeling intense feelings of loneliness and isolation, and in America where she barely speaks the language and pines for her family in Syria every single day. As a developing child in my mother's womb, I would be feeling all of this anxiety, loneliness, panic, impacting the development of my brain and somatic system. When I was born, my mother literally had a panic attack in the delivery room, wanting to make sure that I was indeed a normal human baby. My first moments of life, therefore, were accompanied by my mother's panicked voice and body as nurses and doctors helped calm her down and assuage her fear. I was, in fact, normal. From the very beginning, there was a break in the connection with my mother, this need to feel safety. And I've spent most of my life living the results of that break in the bond with my mom, and now working on ways to consciously heal it. This is a literal example of how trauma passes down in a family, how the effects of genocide reverberate for generations in the actions and behaviors of a broken and traumatized people. A nation is a collective of people and families. So as I sat in Yerevan in the midst of this war, I realized our trauma was being reactivated. A trauma that in many ways has not been truly faced. The Armenian genocide of 1915 and the massacres that preceded it in Sassoon in the late 1890s and Adana in 1909 has not healed in us. We have attempted to carry on. We put it in the past and move forward, be brave. But everything that we know about trauma tells us that it must be dealt with to heal. We have to feel it to heal it. And that's actually true bravery. In order to heal, we must know what we know and feel what we feel. We have to give it a voice and acknowledge it. Because again, trauma isn't just the catastrophic event or circumstance, it's the imprint left behind that now alters and colors the way we see and experience the world. As we've seen, trauma doesn't help us think clearly. It propels us to move from a fractured and skewed place. In our case as Armenians, when we were attacked once again by the same people, we were reactive as opposed to responsive. We were like the king, quickly taking action to ensure that what happened before does not happen again. And it's very understandable given our cultural trauma. Yet, and I sat with these questions. Was it the wisest course of action given our current realities? That we were being attacked by essentially two nations, much more heavily armed and supported in terms of military might? Were we seeing our circumstances absolutely clearly? These questions for me are not about politics, they're not about blame, but something perhaps larger to reflect on, something overarching, an invitation maybe to shift out of the narrative of victimhood. I've had spiritual teachers who've said to me, Instead of asking, why is this happening to you? Ask, why is this happening for you? It's a fundamental reframe. So I began to ponder this. What have we not been facing in ourselves as a collective people? What are our true strengths and powers? Why are we here? And what do we have to offer our global human family? And what arose for me is the following. Armenians are a people of deep innovation and creativity. The first time I went to Yerevan in 2001 to shoot a film, I was the first member of my immediate family to go to Armenia. I was deeply impressed by the city, whose streets were named for artists and writers and poets and musicians, whose currency displays images of the same. To me, this showed what our value system is. It's evidenced by these things, the money we use literally in Armenia, how we give our physical location and sense of direction. Meet me on the corner of Saryan and Pushkin, or Tumanyan and Mashtots. These are the things we celebrate and give value to. Art. We have been identified so strongly with the king in the story of 1001 Nights. Traumatized and unwittingly moving from that place of fragmentation. But we have such a strong inner Scherazad. What if we began to amplify her? We have always honored our cultural heritage, our stunning 1,000-year-old churches and monastery complexes, our extraordinary illuminated manuscripts, medieval. But how do we keep a nation alive in the now and moving forward without deeply honoring, supporting, and helping blossom our culture makers today? How do we maintain Armenianness? And what is Armenianness for a culture that has been so fragmented? In 2017, as I flew back to the US from Bodrum after visiting one of my best friends, Gasia, I had a connection in Istanbul. Osman Kavala, my dear friend, the extraordinary Turkish philanthropist and civil society leader who's now been imprisoned in Turkey for over 3.5 years precisely for his human rights and cultural work, wanted to meet me at the airport for a quick lunch. But we didn't have time, so we were texting and having an exchange about me wanting to spend more time in Turkey, to come back in 6 months and spend half a year learning the language my grandparents and their ancestors who had lived in Urfa and Antep spoke fluently. I had started to open to this idea of weaving and accepting Turkishness as a part of the fabric of who I am, which is something I had battled with for most of my life. And Osman was thrilled. Then he asked, do you feel your Armenianness more when you're in Turkey? I'll never forget, because it's the first time I heard the word Armenianness. And without hesitation or thought, I responded, yes. But I've been pondering the last few years since that exchange, what is Armenianness? It's so individual, this. For me, Armenianness is woven into my connection with Aleppo. It's the city of my childhood summers, where Turkish was spoken in the home and watched on TV alongside the sounds of Western Armenian Arabic, of family friends and acquaintances. For me, Armenianness includes the Turkish songs my grandfather sang, and the rose petal jam my grandmother made, and the Turkish and Arabic words sprinkled throughout our mother tongue of Western Armenian. Armenianness is what's familiar to me, what's familial to me. It's strange that, in a way, the sounds of Turkish and Arabic are more known to me from a childhood place than the sounds of Eastern Armenian. It's natural. It's how I grew up. Armenianness, therefore, is an individual thing. We're all Armenian in our own ways. And perhaps this comes from the fragmentation of our culture, how we've been dispersed and we experience ourselves in different corners of the world with different intersections. There's the Armenianness of a boy who grows up in Persian Armenian family in Tehran, and the Armenianness of a Hayastansi girl raised in a village in Tavush during the Soviet Union, the Armenianness of a fourth generation kid in Boston whose family perhaps immigrated before the genocide. There are shades and versions of our language, differences in cuisine and expression. But for me, it's those summers in Aleppo juxtaposed with a great feeling of alienation in small town Indiana, where I spent 9 months of the school year and spoke Western Armenian only at home in a town that didn't know what Armenians were. And when I would say I'm going to Syria for the summer, they would ask me if I spoke Syrian, whatever that is. Yet all of this is Armenianness. And all of this holds shades of who we are and what we have to offer the world. Our art, our culture, our storytellers, all exploring the facets of what it means to be Armenian and the unique necessary perspective that we can gift the world. We can weave ourselves back together through unity, through creativity, collaboration. Trauma separates, but storytelling bridges and restores. We're people who've seen great darkness. And so therefore, we have a capacity to shed extraordinary light. In fact, we must. We as human beings come into this world, and the experience of being human, of being alive, it's a continuum of breaking and healing and contracting and expanding and moving from darkness to light and back again and again and again. And this continues as long as we're here, as long as we are embodied. There is no life experienced without challenge, without heartbreak, without difficulty. It's just part of this contract of being human. And as we wake up to the mechanisms that engender our own healing, a wisdom arises. The answers are in connection, communication, creation, the domain of our vast, capable, and incredibly resilient hearts. 2 years ago, I went to Aleppo for the first time since the Syrian war began, to the house I had been going to since I was 9 months old, always full of generations of family. Now it was empty for 6 years since my grandmother had passed during the war. This house that my great-grandfather bought, where my grandmother went to as a bride, where my mother was born, where my grandfather hosted the dinner after my baptism in 40 Martyrs Church, where I learned to walk and took my first steps on my first birthday. In this house, in the middle of a war, I discovered a chest trunk full of 150 of my great-great-grandfather's Karagöz shadow puppets, salvaged from Urfa during my family's escape from the persecution of the Armenian genocide. Days later, I fell down the stairs of the family home in the dark of no electricity and the reality of war in Aleppo, and I broke my foot. We have a saying in Western Armenian, "Votkat gadrvi, delat nastir." May you break your foot so you sit in your place. Well, I did. There, in my grandparents' bed, hearing the sounds of traffic outside the window on Suleymaniye, I began to delve into the story of Scherazad. I began to read 1001 Nights. Surrounded by my great-great-grandfather's shadow puppets, literal figures in the play of shadow and light, it began to dawn on me. Yes, I have inherited trauma. And this too, this art, this tool of storytelling is also a part of my legacy, a way to sublimate this trauma. to bring it to light, consciousness, and give it a chance to be released. Over the course of weeks, as the bone in my foot slowly wove itself back together, becoming stronger in the place that it had fractured, a new understanding was weaving itself in me. Maybe things need to break to open new possibilities of knowing and seeing and understanding in us. So I sit with these things now. And I invite us all to consider the great potential of harvesting light from our seeming darkness. It requires a search for the ways back to each other. It is not easy, but to take the first step slowly, gently, with extraordinary compassion, even when others may not yet be able to take it. We do it for ourselves. We do this painful work of healing because as we heal ourselves, we heal each other. We locate our inner Scherazad, our patience, our bravery, our creativity, our vast wisdom, our deepest power, our hearts, knowing we are in this together. This very, very precious being human thing. Thank you.